Right, hello again, year eight. So I'm going to be doing your second lesson today on the Reformation. Okay, I'd like you very quickly, please, if you don't have already, to grab a pen and some paper. Okay, and we're going to start the lesson in just a second. Okay, before we get on with what we're looking at today, and as you can see, the title for our lesson is "Why did the Catholic Church have so much power over medieval Christians?" I want to do a quick recap on just some of the key takeaways from our introduction lesson last time. So, we saw last time that the Catholic Church had lots of power in Europe in medieval times. So, after the fall of the Roman Empire in about the year 500 until 1500, the Catholic Church had a lot of power. They owned about 25% of the land in Europe, and everyone had to pay the church a special tax called a tithe, which was 10% of their income. So, they had a lot of power in terms of wealth. But we also saw the church had a lot of power because they had the power of interpretation. The Bible was written in Latin, and the majority of people couldn't read or write Latin, so the church had a lot of power because only they understood the Bible. We saw then that Martin Luther was a German monk who, after 1517, came to lead a movement that became known as the Protestants. Okay, they were known as Protestants because they protested, complained about the way the church was running up to that point. And the Protestants wanted to, we saw, reform the church, okay? And that's why the process becomes known as the Reformation, okay? Remember, reform means to try and change something to make it better, okay? Now, we learned that the Reformation was important because it led to lots of division and conflict, but also it unleashed brand new ways of thinking. So we saw last time that it meant that Europe became divided into Protestant areas, particularly in Northern Europe, and Catholic ones in the south, which led to lots of war and conflict. So we saw that 40% of Germany's population, for example, was killed in the 30 Years' War from 1618 to 48, which was largely a war between Catholics and Protestants. But we also saw that the Reformation led to new ways of thinking, okay? Because the Bible became translated into vernacular languages, languages that ordinary people could understand, people were encouraged to learn to read and write. So there was a big increase in literacy. And it also encouraged people in Protestant countries to start thinking more independently, okay? They were encouraged to come up with their own interpretations of the Bible, and the ability to read and write and think independently led to them criticizing authority in general. And we saw that some historians have argued that that's one of the reasons why the Reformation is important, is it led to future changes in science and also led to some of the revolutions in the 18th century, because this new way of thinking about looking for evidence for yourself and not just accepting things because people in authority told you them, that way of thinking, once it was unleashed, was very hard to put back in the box. Okay, so we saw that last time. Those are our 5 key takeaways in our introduction. Now, for today's lesson, I would like you just to pause the video now and to get the title down. Okay, so it's "Why did the Catholic Church have so much power over medieval Christians?" And to get us starting to think about this question, I want you just to have a look very carefully at this painting here. And once you have the title down, I want you just to bullet point on your paper 3 things you can see in this painting. Okay, so 3 things you can see in the painting. And once you've got those 3 things bullet pointed, can you also think about what you think the purpose of this painting might have been, and why do you think it was created? Okay, so just pause the video here for a second, write down 3 things you can see, as well as the title, and if you can, maybe have a go at that challenge question. Okay, year 8, so should have the title down as well as those 3 things. If you don't, please pause this and do that quickly first. Now, some things you might have picked out. You might have noticed the bottom down here, what looks like kind of demons or Satan, and they seem to be torturing people. So we can see that some people are being put in a boiling pot here. We can see some people are being grabbed and sort of beaten. We can see these guys are having to walk on fire, etc. Some of you probably worked out that the bottom part is meant to be like hell and the top part like heaven, because we can see angels here, whereas we can see sort of demons here. Some of you might have picked out the ladder in the middle, where people seem to be going from one to the other. Some of you might have also picked out this thing about some sort of weigh scale over here. Okay, now this painting here is a very famous one that actually is just in South London, actually, from about 1300. So this painting is over 700 years old. And these kind of paintings you would have found all over medieval Christian churches, okay? And they were designed to teach the church's followers about the church's teachings about heaven and hell and how to avoid hell and how to get into heaven, okay? And in this, the reason why this painting is called the Purgatorial Ladder is purgatory is very similar to hell. The only difference is that your time in purgatory is time limited, okay? So Catholics believe in three things. They believe in hell, where if you go there, you're just there forever, for all eternity. They believe in purgatory, which is the same as hell in terms of what it's like, but the difference is that you go to purgatory and then eventually you will be allowed to go up into heaven, okay? So that's why these people down here are being tortured in what looks like hell, but then they are eventually allowed to climb out of purgatory and enter into heaven, okay? Purgatory comes from the word purge, which is the Latin for purify. So the idea was that if your soul needed purifying, you'd go into purgatory, you'd be punished for however many years, which would depend on what you'd done. And then eventually, once your soul had been purified, you would be allowed to go to heaven, okay? Now, the reason they used paintings like this to teach the church's ideas about hell was obviously the majority of people couldn't actually read the Bible, which was in Latin. So they had to use paintings like this to sort of really strongly evoke what the church's teachings actually were on things like heaven and hell. Now, if we go back to our idea about the powers of the church. So one big power that the church had was that people really deeply feared the idea about going to hell or purgatory. Make sure after you've watched this video that the next one in the playlist, 2.2, is a little 4-minute explainer about what people's fears of hell, damnation, and fears of heaven, salvation were all about, okay? So, first key power that the church had was people had a deep fear of hell and of purgatory. Now, that linked to the second thing that made them powerful, because remember, our big lesson title for today is why did the Catholic Church have so much power than medieval Christians? The first key one was this fear of hell and purgatory. Now, linked to that as well was the church's knowledge of the Bible, okay? Now, people had this deep fear of going to hell or going to purgatory, but the Catholic Church also taught people that it was only with the church's guidance that you as an individual could get into heaven and achieve salvation. Remember, salvation is the same as going to heaven. It comes from the word salvage, which means to rescue, okay? So they taught people that the only way you could achieve salvation was through the church, and the key reason for that was that you had to rely upon the priests of the Catholic Church to tell you what the Bible said, because as we saw before, the Bible was written in Latin, which most people couldn't understand. Now, that gave the church a huge amount of power, because if you think about it, if everyone is deeply fearful of going to hell or purgatory, and the Catholic Church are the only people who can tell you what you need to do to avoid it, they've got a lot of power. If they tell you, do this thing, or you're going to go to hell, you're probably going to do it, okay? It gives them a lot of power. Now, if we think about a bigger question, why do you think people like Martin Luther and the Protestants might have seen the Catholic Church as exploitative, okay? Remember, exploitative is when you take advantage of people who are weaker than you. The reason why they thought that, I'm sure some of you have thought about this yourself, is they thought that it was exploitative because if you teach people that only you can understand the Bible for them, it's going to mean that they have to rely upon you very strongly in order to get into heaven. And they're probably going to do whatever you tell them. And they're not going to be in a position to challenge you because, as we said last lesson, the Bible is in a language that only the priests can understand. Now, Martin Luther and the Protestants argued that this made the Catholic Church quite corrupt because it meant that they taught people things that weren't necessarily in the Bible, but were things that allowed the church to accumulate more money and power. So a third power that the Catholic Church had was that they charged people for these things called indulgences, okay? Now, if we go back to our little diagram just very quickly about purgatory. So purgatory is like hell, but it's almost like a waiting room, okay? It's like going to jail, and you will spend a certain number of years there depending on how bad the things you've done are. Now, what the Catholic Church taught people, and again, this wasn't in the Bible, but how would people know this if they can't read the Bible to find out for themselves? Is they taught people that one way if you committed sins, one thing you could do in order to avoid purgatory, or at least speed up your time in purgatory, was pay the church money. So they charged people these things called indulgences, which were, you'd come to the Catholic Church and say, this is my sin, so I don't know, I've cheated on my wife, or I've stolen this person's, horse, whatever it was. You'd go to the Catholic Church and say, I've done this sin. They would then charge you a certain amount of money, which you then give to the church. And then the church would say, you're absolved of all your sins. God has forgiven you of your sins, so you will no longer be going to purgatory. Okay? The church's argument for this was they said, well, the church is doing God's work. So if you pay the church money, then you're basically paying God. So this is a way of, making up for any sins you've committed. But for people like Luther, they would say, but that's not in the Bible. You're just making that up in order to exploit people's fears of hell in order to make money off of them. And this practice of charging indulgences, as we're going to see next lesson, was one of the key triggers for the Reformation. Lots of people like Luther thought that the church was exploiting the power it had because of its knowledge of the Bible to basically make money off of people through indulgences. Another way that the Catholic Church in medieval times made money off of people that was somewhat linked to this was they used to charge people to visit relics, okay? So as well as charging people for indulgences, which they told people, look, if you buy these indulgences, you'll avoid purgatory, all the pain you've seen in those paintings, you won't have that anymore. Another thing they taught people was that another way you could avoid purgatory or achieve miracles that could cure you of like diseases and illnesses was to visit the relics of saints, okay? Now, saints were people who the Catholic Church had ordained, had died serving the Catholic Church. So, for example, a lot of you would have heard of St. Patrick, who's the patron saint of Ireland. He was someone who died spreading the Christian Church into Ireland. And people like St. Patrick, after they died in the Catholic Church, what was called beatified them, turned them into saints. What the Catholic Church would do is they would collect leftover body parts of these saints and they'd put them in little boxes or in little places to store. And what they would do is they would charge people to visit these relics, okay? So people would quite often go on pilgrimages, okay? So if any of you have heard of Geoffrey Chaucer and the Canterbury Tales, it's all about people going on these long journeys to visit relics of saints in order to try and get miracles or try and get forgiveness to get out of purgatory. And this was just another way the Catholic Church made money. They taught people to fear the idea of going to purgatory, and they taught people that, well, another way you can avoid purgatory, besides paying us indulgences, is to pay to go on a pilgrimage to visit these relics. So when you got to, say Canterbury to look at the saints of St. Thomas Becket, you would be charged by the church almost like a little toll to be able to do so. So again, that was the fourth power of the Catholic Church. They made money by charging people to visit relics. Okay, now, the main task you've got to do year 8 is you are going to have a little worksheet in a second, which you're going to have to answer some background information questions from. You might find it useful to do your own version of this little diagram on your line paper before you answer those questions. So if you want to, you might want to pause the video here and just create a little sketch of this diagram here of how purgatory worked. Now, once you've done that, you've got a background information sheet with some questions on it. So it will look like that. It should be attached in the files section on Teams, okay? But you can also get it off of here if you want to. Now, at the bottom of that worksheet, which you've got on your files, you've got 8 questions here. I would like you to answer those just on your piece of paper, just from the text. Okay, so just read your way through this. You've got 8 key questions. First question, who led the Catholic Church? France answered that one. Before the Reformation, all Christians living in Western Europe were part of the Roman Catholic Church. This was led by the Pope based in Rome. So your answer to question 1 would just be the Pope led the Catholic Church. Okay, it then goes on from there. So you've got 8 key questions that you've got to answer from that worksheet. There's then also in the assignments tab on Teams, you should also have a knowledge quiz and an exit pass that you have to complete for your teacher. Okay, so those are all of your main tasks for today. Now, just to finish off as well, then, what are our key takeaways from today's lessons? Okay, just as a quick recap of the key points of the lesson. So we saw that in medieval times, people greatly feared going to hell or purgatory. Okay, and they got that from those medieval wall paintings where the church taught people about what hell would look like and what purgatory would be like if you didn't avoid going there. We also saw that people believed that in order to avoid going to hell, they had to do what the Bible said. But we also saw that the Bible was in Latin, and that gave the church a lot of power because people had to rely on the church to interpret the Bible for them. We then also saw that critics of the Catholic Church argued that the church became corrupt and exploited this power, for example, charging people indulgences in order to avoid hell. Those critics also said that the church also made money by charging people to visit the relics of saints on pilgrimages, which they taught people taught people would lead to miracles and the reduction of time in purgatory. Okay, so those are our key points about the powers of the Catholic Church. Please make sure as well, guys, once you have answered those key questions, done your exit passes, to watch the second video, 2.2. It's going to give you a really good just 4-minute summary of the fear of purgatory that we just talked about. Okay, have a lovely day and a good lesson.